Hello everyone and welcome to Pint of Science 2020. We are kicking off the festivities here pretending that I'm at the University of Warwick. Obviously we're not, we're all at home, but we're hoping to bring you loads of amazing science and fun stuff over the next week. So tonight in this little session, you're hearing from two researchers at the University of Warwick. We've got a PhD student, Sam, who is in the physics department, and we've got another PhD student, Evé, who's in WMG, another department at the university. Now, my name is Phil. I am a full-time tinkerer and I just mess about making things and take science out to the public. So I have a lovely time, usually, but I don't get to talk to the public quite as much as I'd like at the moment. So I'm hoping that you all, my lovely audience, can drop lots of questions and lots of comments in underneath these videos as we go along. I'd love to see where you're all from, so get involved with that hashtag Pint20, pint-sized science, and tell us where you're all from. Let's see if we can build a map around the world. If you want to know more of the details, you'll have just seen at the bottom there a website, pintofscience.co.uk. You can see all of the events that are coming up for the entire week of this festival. Now, I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker tonight. So let's say hello to Sam Holt, who's going to be doing his talk, Ctrl-Alt-Delete. Are we living in a simulation? Sam, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Phil. So is our reality real? It's a strange question, really, but a question that's been asked sort of throughout the ages, from Descartes to popular culture references in things like The Matrix. But we wanted to come at Pint of Science from a slightly different angle of what do scientists talk about over a pint. So my name's Sam, as Phil said, and I'm based at the University of Warwick, and I'm doing a PhD in condensed matter physics. And along with another PhD student, Sam Seddon, who sadly can't be here this evening, but he's watching, we wanted to talk about this question, really, that are we living in a simulation? So even though this idea has been around for a long time, it's only relatively recently that it's been formalized into a really nice logical argument. And it was by this man, Nick Bostrom, who's a philosopher at the University of Oxford. And he put together a very compelling argument that back in 2003, since he published his paper, has been popularized by people throughout the world like Elon Musk, then physicists, philosophers, journalists, all sort of doing a really good job at getting this into the public knowledge because it's a really interesting topic. But the more and more I spoke to people, and we spoke to people and each other, the more we realized we didn't actually know the details of this, because it doesn't say what a lot of people think it says, which we definitely are living in a simulation. It just gives that is sort of one of our options. So are we living in a simulation? The best place to start probably is what actually is a simulation. Well, a simulation is sort of like a synthetic approach or investigation to some form of idea. So we try and imitate reality in some way to either do an experiment on it or do some form of prediction. And we want to try and explore the idea that we, humanity, are that imitation of reality. So simulations can cover a vast range of things. Some of the more simplistic simulations are, for example, simulating traffic at a junction. So you have some inputs, you have some variables, for example, like you have number of cars going through, the types of car going through, you have the timing of the lights. You then run your simulations and you get an output. And then this output is the thing which we're interested in. So for example, like in this situation, it will be traffic flow. But with this, well, a lot of people can argue that actually these simulations aren't all used too well for everyone who's been sat in traffic. But this is actually a relatively sort of more simplistic simulation. because there are a lot of other things we use simulations for example, like the weather. So if we want to find out what the weather's going to be like next Tuesday, for example, we take all the data that we can to do with the weather, we chuck it into a simulation, press go, and we have a look what it's going to be like next Tuesday. Obviously, it's a little bit of a simplification, but we can do really amazing things with the simulations we've got nowadays. We can do things like track hurricanes. We can simulate the paths of these hurricanes, the wind speeds that they're going to produce, and give people warnings based on them. But how do we get from where we are now to being able to simulate humans, for example? Well, so we're sat over here now with our simulations of the weather, traffic, things like that. It actually wasn't that long ago when our best games, for example, were things like Pong, about 40 years ago, which were incredibly simplistic in today's terms. But if we think about gaming now, we have virtual reality, we have augmented reality. The rate of increase of this technology is going ridiculously fast, that so many people think that in the not too distant future, we'll be at a stage where we can do human-like simulations. But we're not there yet. So we're stuck over here in the now with our relatively good but not amazing simulations. So if we're discussing whether we are simulated ourselves, one of the questions we've got to ask is, right, well, are we being simulated by some sort of future generation? So it's a rather complicated idea. But as we don't have the technology now, and we're likely to in the future, quite a few people refer to this as sort of like a post-human civilization. So they have post-human technologies. So that's sort of the ability to do these simulations with a rather small amount of their computing power. So these post-human civilizations have got to be simulating their ancestors, their past. So they've got to be doing ancestor simulations. And that's what we are now. So we want to be looking at the chance, the probability that we are one of those ancestor simulations of a post-human civilization. Okay, so where do we start then, really? Well, the first thing is we've got to get from where we are now to where to the future, really, where we can do these simulations. So we've actually got to survive. So when originally writing this talk with Sam, it was it was back before before the days of the global pandemic, and we were chatting about what to put for this, and we had some nice ideas. I'm going to be rather brief on this, as to not to add to the existential crisis this talk already gives during a global pandemic. But what I will say is just we can sum up this survival in sort of like a probability. So we have a probability of survival, where 0 is we definitely don't survive between now and becoming post-humans, and 1 is 100% chance we do survive between now and becoming post-humans. So that's the first thing. We've actually got to get there. But when we get there, we have to run these simulations. So really similarly to what we did before, we can associate, we can give a probability with actually running these simulations. And where 0 is we don't run them, and 1 is 100% definitely absolutely run them. And there are reasons why you might think we would run it or wouldn't. We've always been interested in history. There are history departments around the world studying it. We teach it to school children in every school. So it seems strange if we weren't interested in it in the future. So that's the reason why you might think that probability could be close to 1. But then again, there could be some reasons why we don't run these simulations. For example, these post-human civilizations realize that running these simulations creates conscious human beings, really. and they have ethical concerns about doing this. Therefore, they've banned these sort of things. So it's not 100% certain where this probability is going to lie. But in terms of running simulations, this probability isn't the only thing that's important. It's the number of simulations a post-human civilization will run as well. So how many simulations, this number of simulations here, how many simulations will that future human race run? So this has been argued to be a really, really, really large number. Personally, I'm not going to put an absolute value to it, but I've heard people say in hundreds of thousands, in the millions. Generally based on, we don't just run a single simulation and go, there, we're done. What we do is we run lots of different simulations to check our results using slightly different variables in slightly different methods, different ways, and we build up lots and lots of simulations. We may do it, another group may do it, someone across the world may do it. So this is how we can really easily build up a really high number of these simulations. So just based on these two things, that we actually survive to become post-humans and we run these simulations, we can try and work out sort of the number of simulated people in our universe. So this number actually is relatively simple to calculate. What we do is we take the number of people in each simulation. So for example, if we run a simulation, there'd be about 8 billion people or so. We multiply it by the number of simulations. So if there are 2 simulations with 8 billion people in it, that'll be 16 billion simulated people. Then we also times it by the probability that we actually run these simulations and the probability that we actually survive to become post-humans. So all of this together gives us sort of the number of simulated people who have human-like experiences. So we've got the number of simulated people, but what we're also going to want is the total number of people. So the total number of people who have human-like experiences are going to be the number of simulated people plus the number of people in sort of the actual fundamental reality. So this is the thing we just came up with for the number of simulated people. And then if we just add on the number of people in the fundamental reality, this should give us our total number of people having sort of conscious human-like experiences. Right, so then what we want to do is we want to go, what is actually, if we pick someone at random, what's the chance that that individual is a simulated person? Well, we can take the number of simulated people, divide it by the total number of people, which just looks something like this. This were just the equations we got before. And we can just do a little bit of maths. We have some people on the top, people on the bottom. We can cancel out the people just to get this thing here. And this equation is basically the probability that any one individual we pick is going to be in a simulation. And it's purely dependent on the number of simulations we have, the probability of actually running these simulations, and the probability of us surviving to become post-humans. So we've worked out a way to get this probability. Now let's actually do something with it. So let's try and come up with some different options. So the first option, let's think about if our probability of survival is very small. So it's 0 or incredibly near to 0. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means we go extinct, so not ideal. But if this is 0, we have 0 divided by 1, which means the probability of any individual we pick being in a simulation is 0. Okay? So that if we go extinct, we're never going to pick someone from a simulation. Similarly, we can do the same thing with the probability of running a simulation. So if this probability is 0, then we don't run simulations. And if we don't run simulations, this equation gives out, and it's obvious to think that if we don't run simulations, the probability that anyone we pick is going to be in a simulation is 0. So something interesting happens, though, when we go, actually, what if our probability of survival is pretty good? And our probability of running these simulations is pretty good as well. What if they're actually quite close to 1? So it's a 100% chance that we survive and a 100% chance that we run these simulations. Well, we can just simplify this equation a little bit. And basically, it's only dependent on our number of simulations. And we said before that this number of simulations should be a really, really large number. So let's just take a very small number, for example. So say 50 simulations. So if those future human civilizations only ran 50 simulations, that's 50 divided by 51, that's already a 98% chance that any one individual we pick is going to be in a simulation. But we expect it to be larger than that. So say 1,000. 1,000 divided by 1,001, that's a 99.9% chance that any one individual we pick is going to be in a simulation. And because we expect the number of simulations to be even larger and larger and larger than this probability gets closer and closer and closer to 1. It gets closer and closer to 100%. So that actually, we can call it, it's basically approximately 100%. So any individual we pick is almost certainly going to be in a simulation. So this is one of the interesting bits, that if we can't tell whether we are in a simulation or not, if those individuals in the simulations can't tell whether they are in a simulation or not, we should assign this probability, this p-sim, to our own chance of being in a simulation. So in the case where we are likely to survive and we are likely to run these simulations, it then follows that we are almost certainly in a simulation. So this is the basis of Nick Bostrom's argument that one of 3 things must be true. Either we go extinct before reaching a post-human civilization, we don't run these simulations, or we are living in a simulation. So it's quite interesting how just through sort of logical arguments you can build up something really, really interesting like this. But it does have 1 or 2 assumptions sort of built into it. For example, that we can actually simulate consciousness. So a lot of scientists and philosophers think it's possible, either with the right hardware or the right algorithm, you'll be able to mimic consciousness, but it's by no means universally thought. It's by no means proven. Quite a nice thought experiment to whether we can simulate consciousness has been thought up. And it's basically, if you imagine that you have a brain, a human brain that we know is conscious, knows working well. That brain, just being rather simplistic, I know it's slightly more complicated than this, but is made of things like neurons all communicating with each other. So for example, if we take a single one of these neurons and replace it with a silicon chip, and we get that silicon chip to do the exact same thing as the neurons, so take the exact same inputs and give the exact same outputs, all the neurons surrounding it, all the cells in our brain which communicate to each other surrounding it, won't be able to tell the difference because it's doing the exact same thing. Which means the person won't notice a difference, they'll still be conscious. And if the person notices a difference, well, then it's not doing the same thing as what we told it to do. So that's if we exchange 1 neuron. What if we exchange 2 neurons? Well, the person will still be conscious, it'll be the same. If we 3, 4, we exchange half the neurons. The person will still be conscious and it will still be the same. They'll still have the same experiences, the same thoughts, up to the point where we exchange all of the neurons for silicon chips, and they have a brain which is entirely silicon, but yet are still conscious and have human-like thoughts. So it's a really, really interesting concept. But, well, most of the things I've said so far are more philosophical. But as a physicist, I want to go, right, well, how can we take that and how can we test it? How can we see whether it's true? How can we see whether we're likely to be in a simulation or not? Well, it's not the easiest thing in the world because we don't actually know exactly how these simulations are going to be run. We don't know the technology that's going to be prevalent at the time. We don't know all the little caveats and everything. But what we can say is we can go, right, we know some things about simulations. For example, you can't simulate sort of a continuous, something continuously. You have to chop it up into little chunks. So we would then expect, for example, the universe to be chopped up into really, really, really tiny chunks and simulated on something like a grid or a lattice or a mesh. So these little chunks would obviously have to be really, really small compared to us and what we see and the general experiments we do, because otherwise we would notice them really easily. It's a really strange concept, but it's really similar to, for example, looking at a photograph. If you stand back and look at a photograph, it looks lovely, smooth, and continuous. But if you zoom into an area, you'll see it's all made out of different pixels. So we want to be able to test, well, is this universe made out of different pixels? Is it pixelated on a very, very small level? So how can we go about testing that? Well, if we're not on a grid and we just go into the middle of nowhere in space where there's absolutely nothing around us and look in every direction, all of the directions should look the same. There shouldn't be any difference between looking left, right, up, down. But if we're simulated on a grid and we look on a very, very small scale, looking one direction is no longer the same to looking another direction. So we may see some weird sort of breaking of some symmetries. How do we go about looking for this? Well, physicists have come up with an answer for this as well. The best way that people have done it so far is actually using the cosmic microwave background radiation, so the CMB, which is a bit like the heat left over from the very, very early universe. So in the very, very early universe, things were very, very energetic, very hot. And when light is incredibly energetic, it has a very, very small wavelength. So when we get something very, very small, for example, light with a very small wavelength, it might start interacting and behaving differently when on a grid, on a very small grid, as opposed to in sort of normal continuous space, so to say. So what we can do is we can look at the cosmic microwave background radiation and look at the highest energies of those and go, at the highest energies, so the smallest wavelengths, do we see anything really strange happening? And we go, no, we don't see anything. We don't see anything particularly weird that we would expect from being on a lattice. Okay, where does that leave us? It doesn't mean that we're not being simulated on a lattice. What it does mean is that we can put an upper limit. We can say this is the maximum size which the lattice could be, because if it was any bigger, we would have seen it. And this size is actually incredibly tiny. So it means that this lattice spacing, if we were assuming it to be stacked like cubes, is about 10 to the minus 27 meters. And it's difficult just to get across how small that is. So a proton is about 10 to the minus 15 meters. So this is even dramatically smaller than a proton. This is almost unfathomably small. I'll try and do a comparison. But so in size comparisons, you are to the size of this spacing about what the observable universe is to you. So that's how dramatically small this spacing is. So there are really some interesting things that come out in the physics if we take that we could be in a simulation, and good things to look for. But what about some other consequences? And actually, you can have a think. For that option 3, there are some really interesting other consequences that come about. For example, some theological consequences. Now, it's not often you would hear a physicist talk about theology in a chat, but I think it warrants it in this option 3 that we live in a simulation. So in this option 3, we are being simulated by some future human civilization, some post-human civilization, which means that we have to be simulated by someone or a group of people, whether it's a PhD student in the basement of a future university or a group of historians. But we're being simulated by somebody or something, which sort of brings into question that, well, we almost have a creator in this. The creator isn't divine. They abide by their own laws of physics. They're not immortal. They have to abide by all of their stuff. But there's the possibility of them interacting in our world, in our universe, in our simulation, in ways that don't obey our laws of physics, for example. And also, something I wanted to bring up on this theological note is that actually most of the simulations we do nowadays are run for a specific reason. So we run a simulation to check what the traffic's going to be like, what the weather's going to do, how an epidemic's going to spread, for example. So to try and ward off this existential crisis that comes with this third option, it's very highly likely that if we're in a simulation, we're being simulated for some specific reason, even if it isn't known to us. So this is a really interesting argument that I really suggest you should go and have a look at further. But this simulation hypothesis, which we've heard about lots and has been popular in the media, it doesn't tell us which one of these three things is going to happen or which one is most likely, only that one of these three must be true. So I'll leave it with you to decide which one you think is most likely. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. What an amazing talk. We probably should have warned people that there's going to be existential crises here, and it's only Monday, so we're getting people ready for that already. You are going to be hanging around for some questions slightly later on, aren't you?
I will be, yep.
Fantastic. I'm keeping an eye on the comments. There are some great ones there. There seems to be a Sam hive mind going on in the comments. So you can look forward to some Sam questions to Sam. So we will see you very shortly, Sam. See you soon. Now, checking in on some of these comments, I can see people from all over the world. So let's have a quick check-in with where some of you are commenting from. Hello to Terry Walker from Maine in the USA. So we've gone slightly further afield than London already. Hello to Luis Almeida, hola, in Brazil. So I'm getting quite impressed with this. Okay, so Johan de Wiet, I'm going to guess at Kovac in Belgium. I apologize for my pronunciation. I've never been to Belgium. I might have to correct that now. So it is wonderful to see so many of you from all over the world and lots of people who aren't just called Sam. I'm enjoying watching this discussion in the comments and seeing people answer questions. So do remember, get involved. If you're wondering where all of these comments I'm talking about are, they're in the comments underneath the video, wherever you're watching it. Use the hashtag Pint20 to follow along and see all of this, and you can find out more about what's going on this week. So without further ado, this is kind of the half-time point. Let's bring in our second speaker. So let's say hi to Evé Wheeler-Jones, who, as I mentioned at the start, is another PhD student just like Sam. And her talk is going to be going completely the other way. So we've talked about the entire universe and things on the very biggest scales imaginable. And Evé's going to take us the other way and talk about the very smallest ideas, but I'm sure big thoughts and big powerful images to give us as well. So over to you, Evé.
Thank you, Phil. And good evening, everybody. As Phil said, my name is Evé, and I'm a PhD student in WMG at the University of Warwick. Today, I'm going to give you a quick tour around the world of nanochemistry. And most importantly, I want to point out to you that, in fact, scientists do just want to have fun. So when I started thinking about nanochemistry and nanoscience, I thought a lot about sci-fi and superheroes and like action adventures. I also kind of thought about a man who has ant powers and ability to shrink really small. We're not going to shrink quite as small as that guy can go, not quite into the quantum realm, but today I'm going to shrink you down into the nano realm. So I'm going to start off by shrinking everyone down to the size of a paperclip. Not really that small at the moment, so we'll zoom in even further to the width of a hair. Again, this is not even small enough to go into the nano realm, so we'll zoom even further to the size of a bacteria. Still not small enough. So we're going to go even further, and then we hit nano. 1 centimeter divided by 10 million is actually the size of 1 nanometer, so really small. Being this small allows us to do really cool things. One of which is making potential nanorobots, nanobots, to help you fight diseases. As you saw, we're smaller than a bacteria, so it could easily go inside your body and help fight diseases and illnesses. But I'm not going to be talking about biology because I'm no biologist. What I'm interested in is nanochemistry. So to any chemist that you may ask, the word nano to them springs up ideas of really cool and useful things. One of the main key things why making things nano is so useful is, for example, this big black blob here is one particle. And if we shrink the particle down to nano size, we're getting loads more particles in the same space. It's like getting a lot more for your money. The other thing that chemists love is putting things on the surfaces, changing the surfaces and making them do some kind of function. So if we look at this blob here, this big black particle, if we look at the surface, it's just around the edge. But if we're looking at the smaller nanoparticles, we're getting a lot more surface for the same area. And it becomes a lot more useful because we can use these surfaces to do different things in, for example, catalysis or batteries. So if I give you, we're looking at this as kind of this useful thing to do, but I'd like to propose to you today that actually we do it because it's cool. So the first example I'd like to show you is these particles. These look very much like the example I've just discussed. We've shrunk all these little particles down into really small. As you can see, we're getting a lot more surface area. This kind of thing would be perfect for catalysis. A catalyst is something that helps a reaction speed up, and it usually happens on the surface. So more surface area equals more reactions, and then allows it to happen faster, which is really, really cool. Really useful things happening at really, really tiny kind of diameters. Incredible. And then we move on to things like these. These are nano wires. So you can imagine that these are really useful to connect things together, maybe flow things down. This could be useful for a battery. We could flow electrons between different parts of the battery and hopefully make it function faster and better. And then as I was kind of exploring this a bit more, you kind of come across a few stranger things. For example, these particles. These particles, somehow, it absolutely baffles me how the scientists did this. They have little boxes implanted in the particles. And I kind of thought that this is cool. It's like particles having pockets. They're able to hold chemicals, potentially do reactions in these little boxes, and carry these chemicals around, which is so cool. And then you kind of continue down this route and you kind of start to find more and more funky things. And this is an example of one of them. These are nano flowers. You can see that I think they're a pretty good resemblance. And at this point, I'm like, okay, I feel like scientists are trying a bit of fun here. They're trying to play the artist. Don't get me wrong, the science to actually make things this small is incredible, and the stuff we learn from it is useful. But I think we're just having a bit of fun here. And the next one will also agree with that. So these particles are nano urchins. Again, looking really cool. And now for my favorite one of all time, one that I found while doing my research. Incredible. Nano starfruit. Brilliant. They even had a picture of a starfruit in the paper just to make sure you knew what they were. It's incredible. I don't even know how they thought, I know, let's make really tiny starfruit. Brilliant idea. So when I first started off doing my research for my PhD, I thought, okay, let's have a go at this. Let's see whether I can do anything like this. And I decided that I could make these particles, these bad boys. These are my Nano Maltesers. As you can see, they've even got the honeycomb structure on the inside, which is so cool and surprisingly useful. The honeycomb structure acts a bit like a sponge and helps chemicals be absorbed into the material. So looking cool because they're Maltesers and being useful. And then I thought I'd have a go at my own nano urchins. So these are quite funky, nano urchins again. But personally, I prefer to describe them to my colleagues as hairy balls. I've been Evé Wheeler-Jones. Thank you very much. Please feel free to tweet me your favourite nano or funky science things at EVE_science. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that. And can we pass that back to Phil?
Hello again, everyone, and thank you, Evie. What a brilliant talk. It's so entertaining. I'm not going to clap because the microphone will go really weird, but someone did suggest I could do jazz hands as a nice way of applauding while we're all in strange studios. But thank you, Evie, for that talk. I'm sure you'll be around if anybody does have questions about Nano Maltesers and Nano Starfruits. We can bring you back in during the Q&A session. But for now, thank you very much. See you soon, Evie.
Bye.
So, two amazing talks. I hope you have really enjoyed those and you are really excited. We have got lots and lots of questions coming in. We see lots of them all over the world. And I would love to read out those questions. We do have more time to get them in. Use that hashtag 2020 to drop in the comments. But for now, let's bring Sam back so we can start asking some of these questions. So let's say hello to Sam again. He's there somewhere, I promise you, he's just hiding. But while we are looking for Sam, I just need to say that it's an amazing thing to do. You know, really to chat with you and interact with you at home, especially with you all over the world. We would never be able to get this many people into the hub while we're doing there. So thank you for doing it. Thank you for asking all of these questions. It is absolutely fantastic to interact with you. Share these science. So, apparently my sound is a little bit muffled, so I apologize for that. I'm not sure if anything I can do forward about that just now. But hopefully we can get sound in and we can answer some questions while I put my sound down. Have you got sound there?
Hello.
Hello. Apologies for the sound quality here. Can you hear me okay now?
Sounds a lot better.
Wonderful, wonderful. The blips and the things we have to deal with at the moment, these are all new things to us, aren't they? So you've gone from giving us a chilling insight of what the next Sims game is going to look like. Apparently it's going to take a very dark turn. But one thing I wanted to ask you is, do you think that Hollywood movies and the way that simulations and philosophy, this kind of stuff gets portrayed in pop culture, do you think that's like a really important thing? Do you think it's impressive how well they represent this stuff?
I think it's very good that stuff like this is out in sort of popular culture, even if it's not done 100% physically correctly, just because it gets people to think. And that's what you need to do at the end of the day. If you get these ideas out there, get them out to everyone, even if they're not in sort of their purest form, even if they're slightly more entertaining version, I still think that's definitely worth it.
Fantastic. I think we should be ready for some questions. So here is the first question from another Sam. It's just proving that the Sam hive mind really is going for it. So Sam Mugford would like to know, can you estimate the computing power required to simulate the entire universe?
Yes, it is possible to do that. So I don't know, obviously, off the top of my head exactly what that value is, but in Nick Bostrom's original paper, he did do something very interesting, which was how many sort of operations would it take to simulate all of human history. So, for example, if we were just simulating all of the human brains and then everything else was done as sort of inputs into the brain, so we weren't actually simulating a fundamental universe and then putting people in it, we were just simulating all of humanity's history's brains. How much would that take? And that was about sort of the upper estimates were about 10 to the 36 operations, which obviously by today's standards is absolutely massive, but hopefully maybe achievable at some point in the future.
Some of these numbers just absolutely blow my mind, and there is no way to do a comparison for that, is there?
Oh, no. It's so difficult to give comparisons for any of these numbers, really.
So let's move on to our second question. This is from Vadlamani, and he would like to know, what if the ones running the simulation are in another simulation? I think I had my mind blown by your talk, and now I've had my mind blown by this question. So I'm going to need you take over for a minute.
So yeah, you definitely can get things like this happening. So if you have sort of your fundamental reality being simulated, and then your fundamental reality, and they simulate another reality below that. This simulated reality, humans within that could get to a stage where they become post-human. They have this ability, they have this enough computational power to do another level of simulations, in which case they can start simulating other people and do multiple simulations. So you can almost get sort of a tree effect. So off your fundamental reality, you have another simulated reality. Off that simulated reality, you get multiple simulated realities, One of the issues with that would be is that well, it's slightly complicated, but imagine, I don't know how au fait everyone is with computers. So on a computer, you can run sort of like a virtual machine. So you have your normal desktop, and there's software you can use to basically run another computer inside your computer. And it would be very similar to that sort of thing. It does obviously beg the question, well, how does that use the main civilization's computational power? And the more sub-layers you have, the slower that original simulation is going to run. But it depends whether, well, I think it's unlikely that people within these simulations would actually notice, because there's probably some sort of, whilst I was talking about discrete space steps, there's also likely to be discrete time steps as well. So, for example, one iteration of that computer might be a very small amount of time in our universe. So that if the main computer slows down, time will slow down relative for us as well, and we just won't notice a difference.
Well, everyone's lost track of time in the last 6 months, haven't they? So it's all of a sudden a bit more believable that this kind of thing could happen. That is an absolutely incredible thought, that we could have these nested simulations. But you're right, you'd never have the time to look through all of this stuff, would you? If you were, imagine being the supervisor of the simulation. So our third question is from Stephen. So he would like to know, if we were in a simulation, so imagine that you are actually in the simulation, probably easier for you than for most people, what would you want to know?
Well, so I'd probably, so if we were in a simulation, yeah, would I want to know? I think I definitely would want to know. So in my opinion, it would definitely be better to know and then come to terms with that reality, deal with it as it may. To me, it doesn't induce particularly existential angst or anything like that, because, well, if we are being simulated, if it isn't sort of an ancestor simulation, the simulation is likely to be representative, is likely to want to represent the actual reality, the actual conditions which original fundamental humanity sort of grew up in. So that even by doing stuff like physics, we're still could still somewhat be probing the sort of fundamental reality just through the the filter of our simulation.
That's a fantastic answer. And I think what's even better is you answered the question that's written on the screen rather than the question I read to you. So I'm dealing with my simulated ability to read. We're all trying to keep up. So next question is from James Brown. So if this is a simulation, and this seems to be a little bit of a plug for a brand new movie, but if this is a simulation, could we have very different physics to the physics that are in the actual real world? Things like, could time run backwards? Would we recognize the physics in the so-called real world?
So I just saw Tenet as well. Great movie. But well, I suppose the thing about these simulations is there's a lot of possibility for this sort of thing, but it's mainly sort of spectacle. For example, we could run a traffic simulation with all the cars going backwards, but it's unlikely that many people would want to, sort of thing. For the future humans, they could try and run a simulation with different things going on. But then again, it's not likely that that's going to happen in our reality because there's probably not a high probability, and they don't do that very often. So whilst they can interact with a simulation in ways that may not obey the laws of physics within the simulation, doesn't mean that will happen very often or is even quite likely.
Wow, yeah. These are just such huge concepts. I don't know how you wrap your brain around it. I think if you leave the average person in charge of a simulation, what will happen is they'll build a swimming pool, wait for someone to get in, and then take the ladder away. So I think we need to leave people like you in charge of these simulations.
I've definitely done that before.
So let's see if we can get another question. We've got a little bit more time. We've probably got time for maybe 3 or 4 more questions if we're really quick. So let's go for a lightning round. We've got a question now from Veronica, who would like to know, would you suggest we are being run in a simulation by humans who will begin to exist in this simulation in the future? Or are we being simulated in a separate universe to that of the post-humans?
Wow. So I'm not an expert on this sort of thing, but to me, this argument seems to come from there is some sort of fundamental reality, and then off of that, in it sort of separately, they would simulate something. They may try and recreate events that actually happened. So they may try and recreate, I don't know, some sort of social, political landscape they were interested in.
Maybe a pandemic disease or something like that.
No. We could just be a very, very advanced simulation of how a pandemic spreads. And then that again brings up ethical questions of if this is actually a simulation where a pandemic's spreading in a simulation, then would a future civilization be ethically okay to do that? Because we're obviously feeling the consequences of it. Yeah.
Again, it comes back to these ethical questions of what happens when you leave irresponsible people in charge of the simulations, isn't it? So,
yeah.
So Max would like to know, what do you think would be the hardest part about building one of these simulations?
I mean, I think it's probably definitely the computational power needed. So there are different ways you could go about simulating a universe. You could, for example, have, well, not all of these fit directly into the maths that we were talking about, to the simulation argument, but there have been ideas about, for example, only a single brain is simulated. So you only have one person who's actually conscious, and then everybody else they interact with is basically good enough to pass what's known as the Turing test. So they interact with you and you think they're conscious. But it would definitely be the computational power. So, for example, if the universe was entirely simulated, I think it would probably be likely that they would do something similar to what they do in gaming now, that rather than simulate absolutely everything everywhere there is, you just simulate the bit which people are looking at. So you just render exactly sort of what's on the screen, which would save a lot of computational power in general. And I have heard some people linking that to some stranger physics things, for example, like Schrodinger's cat and things like that. And I definitely don't know how much I sort of buy into that. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting concept.
Absolutely. And if it is a simulation, the graphics are pretty good, aren't they? Some of those sunrises, that must take quite a bit of RAM. But it could be, when people see things like UFOs or things they can't explain, it could just be a glitch in the code, couldn't it?
Absolutely. So that's the sort of thing that some people are looking for as well, that are some of the really fundamental physics equations. Do they come out to look like something similar to what a computer scientist might write as sort of error correction codes and bits like that?
Fantastic. So I'm just going to check on how many more questions we have got time to ask. We've got another one here from Katie Johnston, who would like to know, is there an issue in assuming a post-human society is limited to running simulations in the way that we would run them today?
So it doesn't. So this argument isn't necessarily limited to the method of simulation. So they can be simulated using future technologies, quantum computers. They could be simulated using silicon devices in a similar way to what we do now, but obviously it would have to be on a much, much larger scale. So that I think Nick Bostrom in his original paper was saying that actually you could do it with similar technology to what we have now, but you would need a computer about the size of a planet. So it's not limited to a certain type of technology or a certain type of simulation technique, but yeah.
So, I mean, the big question then is, if you had a computer the size of a planet, you would definitely get some mice to run it, right? So, on to the last question. I'm afraid that this is our last one. This is a question from Bo Biddles, who has a bit of a worry. So hopefully you can put that to put them at ease. So their worry is, just think of the total games of Sims that they've ever played, just as an arbitrary reference, and how many of those were completely forgotten or descended into chaos. So is that why we have now got 2020? Question.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? So realistically, personally, I avoided saying this to the very last minute. I think that third possibility that we are in the simulation is actually quite unlikely. So I think that's probably an unlikely that 2020 is caused by some vindictive child on their video game playing Pandemic or something like that. I think it's probably relatively unlikely, but different people think different options. And as we don't have much evidence on which option's actually the correct one, people are sort of okay to do so.
Absolutely. I think the moment that I realized this wasn't a simulated video game virus was when it got into Madagascar, and that is a very niche video gaming pandemic reference. So I think that is all that we have got time for. So if we could just bring Evé back in for a second so that we can thank them and say goodbye, and do a bit of the jazz hands to say thank you to everybody without ruining our microphones and sound. Thank you so much to Sam for his talk and for answering all of those questions. And thank you to Evé again for your talk. Between you, you've taken us from the very smallest things all the way through to the very biggest thing. And hopefully you've blown everybody's mind at home. Normally at this point during a Pint of Science, we'd be able to say, go off to the bar and go and get yourself a drink. Hope you've got something to celebrate with. Wonderful talks. Thank you very much indeed. So goodbye, Sam, and goodbye, Evé.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you. So, and then that just leaves us with the plan for the rest of the week. Coming up in just over about half an hour, there will be a talk from the University of Oxford. And then at about 9 o'clock tonight, it's bath time for everybody. You get to hear more talks from the University of Bath. If you then look throughout the rest of the week, there is a schedule on pintofscience.co.uk. With all of the rest of the talks for the week that you can tune into each evening. You can get involved with #Pint20 and keep asking us lots of wonderful questions. And On Friday, everything wraps up. There's the Global Science Show during the day as a collaboration with Pint of Science, which is very exciting. And in the evening, there will be a big quiz that you can get involved with. So that is everything from me. Thank you again to Sam and to Evie. Thank you to James and Anna and Rebecca backstage for managing all of this. And thank you at home for watching. Have a lovely week. Bye.
My name is Adam. I will be your quiz master for this evening. I certainly hope you're going to enjoy yourself. Here we go.